A businessman built an empire by making cold decisions, always prioritizing results above all else. Over time, he traded family moments for meetings and left important conversations for later. When he finally notices the silence around him, he understands that something essential was left behind. But an unexpected encounter with a child begins to reveal what he was never able to see. If this beautiful story of overcoming and love interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us from which city you are watching us continuing. Roberto Almeida always knew exactly what he wanted. Since he was very young, when he still lived in a cramped apartment in the east zone of São Paulo with his parents and 2 siblings, he had mapped out a clear plan to build something big, something that would take him out of that reality of tight bills and weekends without options. It wasn't just ambition, it was pure determination, the kind that burns inside and leaves no room for hesitation. At 23 years old, while studying administration at a private college that he paid for with his intern's salary, Roberto founded his first company. It was small, almost insignificant. Just him, a partner who left 2 years later, and a rented commercial room on Rua Voluntarios de Patria in Santana. But what it lacked in structure, it made up for in discipline. He worked 16 hours a day, no weekends, no holidays, no excuses. Each client was one with the same intensity as someone fighting for their own survival. And it worked. In 5 years, the company grew. In 10, it was already a reference in the technology and business consulting market. At 40 years old, Roberto Almeida was no longer the boy from the East Zone. He was one of the most respected businessmen in São Paulo, with offices in 3 capitals, a team of more than 200 employees, and a revenue that impressed even the most skeptical. He had made it, proved it, won. But something happened on that path, something silent which he would only notice much later. Helena entered Roberto's life when he was still building everything. They met at a corporate event, one of those full of motivational speeches and forced networking. She was an architect, working in a small but promising office, and had a light way of speaking that contrasted with the permanent tension Roberto carried on his shoulders. They talked for hours that night. She laughed at the unfunny jokes he tried to make. He was surprised to realize he was relaxed for the first time in months. They married 2 years later, in a simple but beautiful ceremony at a buffet in Morumbi. Few guests, nothing exaggerated. Helena wanted something intimate. Roberto, at that time, could still balance her desire with his own haste to get back to work. Julia was born a year and a half after the wedding. Roberto remembered perfectly the day he held his daughter for the first time in the maternity ward. That small, fragile weight in his arms, the closed eyes, the scent he didn't know how to describe, but that remained engraved. At that moment, he promised himself he would do everything for her, that she would never lack anything, that she would have all the opportunities he didn't have. Lucas arrived 3 years later, another boy Roberto promised to protect, educate, and prepare for a difficult world. And he kept those promises, in his own way. The house in Pinheiros was spacious, well located, with a green area that Helena loved to tend to. Julia and Lucas studied at one of the best private schools in the city. They had English classes, swimming, judo. They traveled on vacations. There was never a lack of clothes, food, or technology. Roberto was proud of that. He was giving his children everything he had always dreamed of having. But presents was another story. In the beginning, he even tried. He would come home for dinner a few times a week. He took Julia to the park on Saturdays. He watched Lucas's soccer games. But as the company grew, these moments became rarer. It wasn't bad will, it was necessity. Or at least that's what he told himself. A meeting that couldn't be postponed. An important client who needed attention. An urgent problem that only he could solve. There was always a valid reason, a solid justification. And Helena, in the beginning, understood. Or pretended to understand. She would call to let him know that Julia had won a medal at school. He promised to arrive early to celebrate, but a last-minute negotiation would arise. Lucas had a birthday and asked his father to stay at least until the end of the party. Roberto stayed for half an hour, answered emails on his cell phone while the children played, and left before the cake. Helena tried to talk. She tried to explain that the children were growing up, that these moments wouldn't come back, that money didn't replace presence. Roberto listened, nodded, promised to improve. And he really believed he would improve. But on the following Monday, he was again immersed in spreadsheets, strategies, and endless meetings. Over time, Helena stopped demanding. She stopped calling to announce the children's achievements. She stopped inviting him to school events. She simply accepted that he wouldn't be there. And this silent acceptance was, perhaps, the clearest sign that something had broken. Julia, who was attached to her father when she was little, began to treat him with a distant politeness. She answered in monosyllables when he asked about school. She no longer told him about her friends, her dreams, or her teenage anxieties. She had learned that he wasn't really interested. He was just following a protocol. Lucas, being younger, still tried for a while. He would run to the door when he heard his father arrive. He showed the drawings he made. He asked to play video games together, but Roberto always had something more important to do. Until Lucas also gave up. He stopped running, he stopped showing, he stopped asking. Roberto noticed all of this vaguely, like someone seeing a landscape through a car window at high speed. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't have time to stop and investigate. After all, he was building a future for all of them. He was ensuring security, stability, comfort. Didn't that count? Didn't that? At 45 years old, Roberto Almeida had achieved everything he had planned in his youth. His company was solid, respected, and profitable. He lived in a house that many envied, drove imported cars, and had access to exclusive places. He could buy practically anything he wanted. But when he arrived home late at night, after another exhausting day, and found everyone already asleep, he felt something strange, a void he couldn't name. He would go up to the bedroom, take off his suit, shower, and lie down next to Helena, who pretended to sleep. And he would stay there in the dark, looking at the ceiling, trying to understand why victory had such a bitter taste. He didn't know it yet, but that void was just beginning. On an ordinary Tuesday, Roberto had a particularly difficult meeting. An important investor had signaled that they might withdraw capital from the company, not because of financial problems, but for strategic reasons that Roberto considered absurd. He argued, negotiated, and used every resource of persuasion he had. In the end, he managed to keep the investor, but he left the meeting exhausted, with a throbbing headache and a feeling that he was fighting an endless war. On the way home, he stopped at a light on Avenida Rebusas. He looked to the side and saw a young couple walking hand in hand on the sidewalk. They were laughing at something, completely absorbed in each other. Nothing special. Just a happy couple on a Tuesday night. Roberto felt a strange pang in his chest. When was the last time he and Helena had laughed together? When was the last time they had a real conversation that wasn't about bills, house repairs, or practical decisions about the children? He couldn't remember. The light turned green. Roberto accelerated, trying to push away that bothersome thought, but it persisted like a shadow that refuses to disappear. That night, upon arriving home, he found Helena reading in the living room. Julia was in her room with headphones on. Lucas was already asleep. The house was silent. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of people who coexist without really connecting. Roberto poured himself a whiskey and sat in the armchair in front of the turned-off television. Helena raised her eyes from the book for a second, then went back to reading. Not even a good night, not even a "how was your day?" Nothing. And Roberto, for the first time in a long time, felt fear. Not the kind of fear he felt in risky negotiations or complex business decisions. It was a different fear, deeper. The fear of having lost something he didn't know how to recover. The fear of having built an empire of glass, beautiful on the outside, but empty on the inside. He finished his whiskey in silence, went up to the bedroom and lay down without making a sound. Helena arrived half an hour later, lay on the other side of the bed, maintaining the usual distance, and Roberto stayed there, awake until late, listening to her breathing, feeling the small physical distance but the immense emotional one that existed between them. Something needed to change, but he still didn't know what or how. The following days passed in an automatic routine that Roberto knew well. Waking up at 5:30, gym, quick shower, breakfast without conversation, car, office. Meetings, decisions, problems, solutions. Business lunch, more meetings, endless emails. urgent phone calls, until the sun set and the city lit up its lights. But Roberto continued there, at the glass desk of his office on the 12th floor of a commercial building on Avenida Faria Lima, looking at spreadsheets that were starting to lose meaning. He tried to concentrate, but that strange feeling that had arisen on Tuesday wouldn't go away. It was as if someone had turned on a dim light in a dark room he had avoided entering for years. Now, even without wanting to, he could see the outlines of what was there, and he didn't like what he saw. On Thursday, Helena called during the afternoon. Roberto was in a meeting with the marketing team, but he answered because she rarely called the office. "Hi, it's just me," she said, with that polite and distant voice she used with him lately. "I forgot to mention that I'm going to have dinner with Mariana tonight. There's food in the fridge if you get home early. Julia is going to sleep at Beatrice's house. Lucas is with Pedro." "All right," Roberto replied, also on autopilot. She hung up without saying goodbye. Roberto stared at his cell phone for a few seconds before returning to the meeting. No one at home. Another empty night. He could work late without guilt, with no one waiting. He should feel relieved. But he didn't. He left the office at 9 at night. The traffic was lighter. He arrived home in 40 minutes. The house was in darkness, silent. He turned on only the kitchen light, heated the food Helena had left, ate alone at the counter, washed the plate, and turned off the light. He went up to the bedroom and stayed there, sitting on the edge of the bed, not knowing what to do. He turned on the television, turned it off after 5 minutes. He picked up his laptop to answer emails, but the words seemed scrambled on the screen. He closed it. It was 10 o'clock on a Thursday, and Roberto Almeida, a 45-year-old man, successful, financially stable, had absolutely nothing to do, no one to talk to, no place he needed to be. And that hurt in a way he didn't expect. He tried to sleep but couldn't. He stayed awake until late, thinking about things he usually pushed to the back of his mind. He thought about Helena, about how she had changed over the years. Or maybe she hadn't changed. Maybe he had just stopped paying attention. He thought about Julia, who was now 17 and was almost a stranger to him. He thought about Lucas, 13, who no longer sought him out to play or talk. When he finally slept, it was past 1 in the morning. On Friday, he woke up with that headache that comes from poorly slept nights. He went to the office anyway because that's what he did. Always. Work was the only constant in his life, the only thing that made sense, that had clear rules and measurable results. But on that day, not even work brought the usual relief. During a meeting with investors, Roberto realized he was drifting. Someone asked a question about projections for the next quarter, and he had to ask them to repeat it. That never happened. He was always in control, always attentive, always a step ahead. One of the partners called him for a private conversation after the meeting. "Everything okay with you, Roberto? You look tired." "I'm great," Roberto replied, automatic. "Just a busy week." The partner looked at him with that expression of someone who doesn't believe it, but won't insist. "Okay, if anything comes up, let me know." Roberto went back to his room, closed the door, sat in the leather chair and stayed there, looking out the window. Down there, São Paulo moved in its frenetic rhythm. Cars, people, haste, everyone going somewhere, everyone with a clear purpose. And him, where was he going? At 6 in the evening, something rare happened. Roberto decided to leave. He had no meeting scheduled for the night, no urgency that couldn't wait until Monday. He grabbed his briefcase, turned off the computer, and told the secretary he was leaving. In the elevator, alone, he felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. Leaving early should be good, but the truth is he didn't know what to do with free time. It had been so long since his life was only work that he had forgotten what existed beyond that. On the way home, instead of taking the usual route via Marginal Pinheiros, Roberto decided to go through alternative streets. He wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in years, he wasn't in a hurry. It was then that he stopped at a signal on Rua Cardeal Arcoverde, near the subway, that he saw the boy. He was on the sidewalk, next to a woman who seemed to be his mother. The woman was selling candies and gum to the passing drivers. The boy, who must have been about 8 or 9 years old, was holding a cardboard box with more products. But he wasn't offering anything, He was just there, standing still, looking at people with that way of a child who has already seen more of life than he should. Roberto observed the scene for a few seconds. It wasn't uncommon. São Paulo was full of situations like that. He had seen it hundreds of times. Normally, he would look ahead and continue. Sometimes he gave some spare change, more out of reflex than a true desire to help. But on that day, something made him keep looking. The boy had disheveled hair, a dirty shirt, and shorts that were too big. But his eyes had a disturbing clarity. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't revolt. It was just a quiet acceptance of his own reality. The light turned green. Roberto accelerated, but the image of the boy stayed stuck in his mind. He arrived home and found Helena tidying the living room. She seemed surprised to see him. "Home early today?" "Yes, I thought we could have dinner together." Helena hesitated. "Julia is going out with friends. Lucas is at a classmate's birthday, just the two of us then." She said it as if it were a problem, or maybe it was just a statement. Roberto didn't know how to interpret it. "All right, should we order food?" "I've already prepared pasta. It'll be ready in 20 minutes. They ate dinner in silence. Helena ate slowly, looking at her plate. Roberto tried to start a conversation a few times, but the answers were short, polite, empty. There was no connection. There was no intimacy. They were two strangers sharing a meal. After dinner, Helena said she was going to watch a series in the bedroom. Roberto stayed in the living room alone again. He turned on the television, but wasn't paying attention. His mind kept going back to the boy at the light. Why? He didn't know. Maybe because in those eyes he saw something that deeply bothered him. In the following days, Roberto began to take that alternative path frequently. He told himself it was to avoid the traffic on the marginal, but the truth was that he wanted to see if he would find the boy again. And he did, on Tuesday at the same light. The mother was there selling. The boy was beside her with the little box. Roberto rolled down the window and waved to the woman. "How much for the candy?" 50 cents, she replied with a tired smile. "Give me 10. She took the candies and handed them over. Roberto gave her a 20 real bill. "Keep the change." The woman thanked him, surprised. The boy looked at Roberto with that same quiet expression. He didn't smile. He didn't say thank you. He just looked. The light turned green and Roberto moved on. On Thursday he returned. He gave more money. The woman already recognized him. The boy did too, but he remained silent, just observing. On Friday, Roberto parked the car in a nearby spot and got out. He walked to where they were. The woman got a little tense, as if she expected some kind of trouble. "What's his name?" Roberto asked, looking at the boy. "Matthias," the woman replied, "and I'm Clarice." Roberto crouched down in front of the boy, getting at eye level with him. "Hi, Matthias." The boy stared at him, serious. "Hi. Do you go to school?" "I do, in the morning." "Do you like it?" Matthias shrugged. "It's cool." Roberto didn't know what else to say. He wasn't used to talking to children. With his own children he barely spoke. But there was something about that boy that made him restless. He stood up and looked at Clarice. "Are you here every day?" "Not every day, but most of them, yes. It's the way we have." Roberto nodded, took out his wallet and gave her a few more bills. "Bye, Matthias." The boy just waved back. Roberto returned to the car with a strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't exactly guilt. It was something he couldn't name, a restlessness that wouldn't go away. In the following days, he continued passing by there. Sometimes he stopped and talked for a few minutes. Other times he just waved. Matthias began to feel more at ease, telling things about school, about his friends, about the cartoons he liked to watch. And Roberto, without realizing it, began to look forward to these encounters. They were brief, superficial, but there was something genuine in them, something that didn't exist in any other part of his life. Matthias didn't treat him like an important businessman. He didn't pretend interest. He didn't want anything other than a simple conversation. And Roberto, for the first time in a long time, felt that he was really connected with someone. Even if it was with an 8-year-old boy he barely knew. 3 weeks had passed since the first meeting with Matthias, and Roberto noticed that his routine had changed in a subtle but significant way. He still worked long hours, still had endless meetings, and still carried the responsibility of decisions that affected hundreds of people. But now, in the middle of all that, there was a pause. A moment when he left the office a little earlier, took the alternative route through Cardiel Arcoverde, and stopped for a few minutes to talk to a boy selling candies on the street. It made no rational sense. Roberto knew that. His partners would find it strange if they knew. Helena probably wouldn't understand. But he couldn't stop. Mateus had something Roberto couldn't find anywhere else, a disconcerting simplicity. The boy didn't pretend. He had no ulterior motives. When he was happy, he smiled. When he was tired, he said he was tired. When he didn't want to talk, he stayed quiet. There was no game. There was no mask. And this somehow exposed everything that Roberto had become. On a rainy Tuesday, Roberto stopped as usual. Mateus was leaning against a pole, protecting himself from the fine drizzle that was falling. Clarice had gone to buy more merchandise at a nearby store, leaving her son waiting. "Where's your mother?" Roberto asked, lowering the window. "She went to buy more stuff. She'll be right back." "Want to wait inside the car? It's raining." Mateus hesitated, looked around as if he expected someone to say if he could or not. Then he shrugged and opened the passenger door. He entered slowly, carefully, as if he were afraid of getting the beige leather seat dirty. Roberto turned on the heater. Mateus looked around, fascinated by the buttons, the dashboard screen, the smell of a new car. "This car is very pretty," the boy said with the honesty of someone who isn't trying to please, just stating a fact. "Thank you." "It must be expensive." "Yes." Mateus ran his hand over the dashboard delicately. "One day I'm going to have a car like this." Roberto smiled. "You really will, you just need to study hard." "That's what my mother says. She says school is important." "And do you believe her?" "I think so," Mateus replied, pensive. "But it's hard sometimes. My friend Daniel stopped studying because he needed to work for real. He said school doesn't help much when you're hungry." Roberto felt a tightness in his chest. "Have you ever been hungry?" "I have, but not so much now. My mother manages to buy food." There was a silence. Roberto didn't know what to say. All his worries, all his problems that seemed so big suddenly became small before the simple and harsh reality of that boy. "And your father?" Roberto asked, not knowing if it was appropriate. "He left when I was little. My mother said he couldn't stay. I don't really know what that means." "Do you miss him?" Mateus thought for a moment. "I don't know. I don't remember him much. Sometimes I think so, but my mother is very good. She takes care of me." At that moment, Clarice returned carrying 2 bags. She saw her son inside the car and became tense. "Mateus, what are you doing in there?" "It's raining, Mom. The gentleman let me in." Clarice looked at Roberto, not knowing whether to thank him or be worried. Roberto opened the door and got out. "Don't worry, I was just talking to him." She nodded, still cautious. "Mateus, get out. We need to work." The boy got out of the car and went back to the sidewalk. Roberto stood there for a moment, looking at the two of them, mother and son, working together under the rain, trying to survive. And suddenly, he felt ridiculously small. On the way home, Roberto couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. Mateus was 8 years old and already knew hunger. He had already lost his father. He already needed to work after school to help his mother. And even so, there was a lightness in him, an ability to be present, to smile, to marvel at a beautiful car. When Roberto was 8 years old, he lived with his parents and siblings in a cramped apartment. He wasn't rich, but he had never gone hungry. He always had school, clothes, food. And even so, he held a grudge from that time. He felt he had been wronged by life, that he deserved more. Mateus had much less, and he held no grudge, he just lived. This realization was like a punch to the stomach. At home, Roberto found Helena preparing dinner. Julia was in her room as always. Lucas was watching television in the living room. "Hi," Roberto said, taking off his jacket. Helena just nodded her head, without taking her eyes off the pot. Roberto went to the living room and sat down next to Lucas on the sofa. The boy glanced at him, then returned his eyes to the screen. "What are you watching?" "A cartoon." "Can I watch it with you?" Lucas seemed surprised by the question. "You can." They stayed there side by side in silence. Roberto tried to pay attention to the cartoon, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about how much time had passed since the last time he sat with his son just to be present, without a cell phone in hand, without a laptop, without being in a hurry to go somewhere else. Lucas laughed at some scenes. Roberto smiled hearing his son's laughter. He had forgotten what that sound was like. When the episode ended, Lucas stood up. "I'm going to eat dinner." "Wait," Roberto called. "Are you liking school?" Lucas seemed confused by the question. "I am." "And soccer. Do you still play?" "I do, every Wednesday and Saturday." "Have you ever invited me to watch?" "I have several times, but you could never go." The sincerity of the answer cut deep. Roberto swallowed hard. "When is the next game?" "Saturday at 10 in the morning." "I'll be there." Lucas stared at him skeptical. "Seriously?" "Seriously!" "Okay," the boy said without much conviction, and went to the kitchen. Roberto stayed there, alone in the living room, feeling the weight of his own absence. How many times had Lucas made that invitation? How many times had Roberto promised to go and didn't? How many disappointments could a 13-year-old boy accumulate before he stopped believing? At dinner, he tried to talk to Julia, but she barely responded. She was on her cell phone, typing frantically. "Julia, can you put the phone away during dinner?" Roberto asked. She raised her eyes, surprised and irritated. "Seriously? Are you being serious right now?" "What do you mean?" Julia slammed the phone on the table. "You spend your whole life glued to your phone, to your laptop, answering emails, and now you want to give an etiquette lesson." "Julia, don't talk to your father like that," Helena intervened, but without much energy. "No, let her," Roberto said. "She's right." Julia seemed even more surprised. "I am?" "You are. I really do that, and it's wrong." The girl didn't know how to react. She stayed there, looking at her father as if she was seeing a stranger. "I'm sorry," Roberto continued. "I know I haven't been a good father. I know you guys tried and I pushed you away, but I want to change that." No one said anything. The silence was heavy, loaded with years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. Helena was the first to speak. "Roberto, you've said that before." "I know, but this time it's different." "Why?" Roberto had no answer for that. Or rather, he did, but he didn't know how to explain it. How to say that an 8-year-old boy selling candies on the street had shown him everything he was losing. How to explain that Mateus's simplicity had exposed the empty complexity of his own life. "It just is," he finally said. Helena sighed, tired. "We'll see." Dinner continued in silence, but it was a different silence. There was something in the air. A fragile possibility, almost imperceptible, but present. In the following days, Roberto tried to keep his word. He arrived home earlier a few times. He asked about the Children's Day. He tried to start conversations, but it was difficult. There was an abyss between them that wouldn't be crossed overnight. Julia remained distant, protected by years of disappointments. Lucas was more receptive but cautious, like someone who doesn't want to get excited so as not to get hurt later. And Helena? Helena was polite, cordial, but cold. She had built walls that Roberto didn't know how to tear down. On Saturday, Roberto woke up early. He had a meeting scheduled with an important client. Normally, he would go without thinking twice, but he remembered the promise he had made to Lucas. He called the client and asked to reschedule. The man was irritated and said it was a lack of professionalism. Roberto agreed, apologized, but didn't back down. At 9:30 he was ready. He grabbed the car keys and went down. Lucas was in the living room with his soccer bag. "Shall we go?" Roberto asked. The boy looked at him, surprised. "Are you really going?" "I said I would." On the way to the club, Lucas was quiet. Roberto tried to start a conversation, but the answers were short. It was strange. It was uncomfortable, but it was a start. The game was on a small synthetic grass field. There were other parents in the bleachers, talking and cheering. Roberto sat down, alone, observing. When Lucas entered the field, he looked at the bleachers. He saw his father there. For a second, his face lit up. Then he became serious again, but Roberto noticed. The game started. Lucas played well. He was fast and skillful. Roberto felt proud, and also sadness because he realized how much he had lost, how many games, how many goals, how many victories and defeats that he hadn't witnessed. At halftime, Lucas ran to the bleachers. "So, is it cool?" "You play very well, son." Lucas smiled. A genuine smile, one of those Roberto hadn't seen in years. When the game ended, Lucas came running. "We won! I saw you were the best on the field." On the way back, Lucas talked non-stop. About the team, about his friends, about the training sessions. Roberto listened, really listened, without thinking about work, meetings, or anything other than that moment. And for the first time in a long time, Roberto felt like a father. It wasn't enough to fix years of absence, but it was a start. And starting, Roberto was learning, was the hardest part. The weeks that followed brought a strange and uncomfortable routine. Roberto continued trying to get closer to the family, but every gesture was received with suspicion. Lucas was more open, it's true. After the soccer game, the boy began to tell more things, to ask for his father's opinion on small daily matters. But Julia and Helena were insurmountable walls. Julia answered in monosyllables when he tried to talk. She left the room when he entered. She put on headphones as a physical barrier between them. Roberto tried several times, but always hit the same cold wall of accumulated resentment. On a Thursday night, he knocked on her bedroom door. "Julia, can I come in?" "It's open." He opened the door slowly. Julia was lying on the bed, messing with her cell phone without looking at him. "I wanted to know if you need anything, if you want to talk about something." "No." "Julia, I know I messed up, I know I wasn't present, but I'm trying to change that." She finally took her eyes off the phone and stared at him. "You know what's funny, Dad? You always had time for everything, for meetings, for clients, for trips, but you never had time for me." "I know, and I'm very sorry." "You are?" Julia let out a humorless laugh. "You're sorry now. But where were you when I won first place in the science fair? Where were you when I got sick at school and Mom had to rush from work to pick me up? Where were you on all the birthdays where I blew out the candle wishing you would arrive before it ended?" Roberto felt every word like a blade. He didn't know what to say. Because there was no defense, there was no justification. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice choking, "but I can try to be different now." "For how long?" Julia asked, her eyes watering. "Until the next important meeting, until the next client who needs attention. I've already seen this movie, Dad, and it always ends the same way. With you leaving." She went back to her phone, making it clear that the conversation had ended. Roberto stood there for a few more seconds, then left, closing the door slowly. In the bedroom, Helena was reading in bed. Roberto sat on the edge, his head down. "She hates me." "She doesn't hate you," Helena said without taking her eyes off the book. "She just learned not to expect anything from you." "And you?" Roberto asked, turning to face her. "Do you still expect anything from me?" Helena finally closed the book and looked at him with that tired expression that had become so common in recent years. "I don't know, Roberto. Sincerely, I don't know anymore. I'm trying." "Okay, I see that. But trying doesn't erase 20 years of absence. It doesn't erase all the times I asked you to stay and you left. It doesn't erase all the nights I slept alone while you worked until dawn. It doesn't erase all the plans I made and you cancelled." "I know that, but what do I do? Give up?" "I don't know. You're the one who has to decide what you want, because if you're going to go back to being what you were in a month, it's better not to even try. We've already gotten used to your absence." That hurt more than anything Julia had said. The idea that they had gotten used to living without him, that he had become dispensable in his own family. "I don't want to give up," Roberto said with a firm voice. "I know it will take time. I know you guys don't trust me anymore, but I'm not going to give up." Helena looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "We'll see." She went back to opening the book. Roberto sat there, feeling the weight of the distance between them, even being just a few centimeters away. At work, things began to get complicated. Roberto had rescheduled several important meetings in recent weeks. He had left early. He had refused trips, and this was not going unnoticed. In a meeting with the partners, the subject came up. "Roberto, we need to talk about some issues," Marcelo, one of the oldest partners, said. "You've been different lately." "How so different?" "Less present, less focused. You rescheduled the meeting with Tech Global 3 times. You refused to go to the meeting in Brasilia. You've been leaving early every week. I'm trying to better balance my personal life with work." Marcelo exchanged looks with the other partners. "We understand that, but you are the CEO of this company, Roberto. People depend on you. Clients depend on you. We are at a critical moment with the expansion to the south. It's not the time to take your foot off the gas." "I'm not taking my foot off. I'm just reorganizing priorities." "And what is the priority now? Because for us, it was always the company." "The company continues to be important, but it's not the only thing in my life." Another partner, Fernando, spoke up. "Roberto, you built this company from scratch. You were always the most dedicated of all of us. What happened?" "I realized I was losing other important things." "Look," Marcelo said in a more serious tone, "we respect you, you know that. But if you're no longer committed to this here, maybe it's time to rethink your position." Roberto felt his blood run cold. "What do you mean?" "I'm saying that we need a CEO who is 100% focused. If you're no longer like that, maybe it's better to make room for someone who is." "Are you guys threatening me?" "It's not a threat. It's reality. The company is growing, competition is increasing, we can't afford to have a divided leader." Roberto looked around the table. Some partners avoided his gaze. Others agreed with Marcelo. He had built that company. He had sacrificed everything for it, and now they were questioning his commitment because he wanted to have a life beyond work. "I need to think about this," Roberto said, standing up. "So do we," Marcelo replied. Roberto left the meeting with his mind in a whirlwind. He went back to his room, closed the door and sat in the chair. He looked out the window at São Paulo down there and felt a strange vertigo. He had built all of that, every brick, every step, and now he was being pressured to choose between the empire he built and the family he neglected. The old version of him wouldn't hesitate. He would choose the company without thinking twice. After all, it was for the company that he had sacrificed so much. But now he wasn't sure. That afternoon he left early again and passed the signal where Mateus used to be. The boy was there with Clarice. When he saw Roberto, his face lit up. "Mr. Roberto!" Roberto stopped the car and got out. "Hi, Mateus, how was school today?" "It was cool. The teacher said I did well on the math test." "That's great, congratulations." Clarice smiled, proud of her son. "He's good at math, always has been." Roberto looked at the two of them and felt that familiar pang in his chest. "Mateus, can I ask you a question?" "You can." "Are you happy?" The boy seemed confused by the question. "I think so." "Even with everything being difficult?" Mateus thought for a moment. "It's hard sometimes, but I have my mother. I have my friends at school. I have Toddy, my dog. He's not a purebred, but he's cool. So I think so. I'm happy." The simplicity of the answer was devastating. Mateus had almost nothing, but he had the things that mattered. And he was happy. Roberto, on the other hand, had everything, and he was empty. "You are a very smart child, Mateus." The boy smiled. "My mother says that too." Roberto gave Clarice more money, waved to the two of them, and got back in the car. On the way home, he thought about the meeting with the partners. He thought about Julia, about Helena, about Lucas. He thought about Mateus. And for the first time in his life, Roberto Almeida didn't know what the right choice was. He arrived home and found Lucas doing homework in the living room. He sat down next to him. "Need help?" Lucas looked at him surprised. "Do you understand Brazilian history?" "I understand a little." "Then can you help me here?" They spent the next hour together, looking at the book, talking about the old republic, laughing at the funny illustrations. It was simple. It was banal. But it was real. When they finished, Lucas closed the notebook. "Thanks, Dad." "You're welcome, son." "Are you going to my next game? It's Saturday again." "I'll be there." Lucas smiled and went up to his room. Roberto stayed there, alone in the living room, feeling something strange in his chest. It wasn't complete happiness. It wasn't absolute peace. But it was something like purpose. That night, lying in bed, he made a decision. He wasn't going to give up on his family, no matter how long it took, no matter how many times Julia rejected him, no matter how cold Helena continued to be. But he also wasn't going to give up the company without a fight. There was a path. There had to be. A way to balance everything, and he was going to find it. Even if it meant confronting the partners, even if it meant restructuring everything. Because for the first time in a long time, Roberto Almeida knew what really mattered. And it wasn't power, it wasn't money, it wasn't status. It was connection, it was presence, it was love. And for that he was willing to fight. The pressure increased in the following weeks like a pot on the fire, about to explode. The partners scheduled an extraordinary meeting to discuss the restructuring of the company. Roberto knew what that meant. They wanted to remove him from the CEO position, or at the very least, drastically reduce his decision-making power. Marcelo had made that clear in a tense call on Monday. Roberto, we need to formalize some changes. You will continue as a partner, obviously, but the operation needs someone more present, more dedicated. You're replacing me. It's not a replacement. It's reorganization. You continue to have a share in the profits. You continue to be an owner, but the daily management will be with someone else. And who would that person be? Fernando. He's willing to take over. Roberto felt a dull anger rise in his chest. Fernando. The same one who had always been second in everything, who never had the courage to found anything alone, who always followed Roberto's orders without question, and now he wanted to take his place. When is the meeting? Friday, 2 in the afternoon. I'll be there. I hope you understand that it's for the good of the company. I understand perfectly, Roberto said and hung up. He sat in the office chair for a long time looking at the city down there. Everything he built was about to be taken from him. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he wanted to fight. The old version of Roberto would have entered that meeting prepared for war. He would have brought data, arguments, proof that no one would do a better job than him. He would have threatened, pressured, and done whatever was necessary to maintain control. But now he was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of proving, tired of sacrificing everything for a company that, in the end, was just a company. That night he arrived home earlier. Helena was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Julia was in her room. Lucas was watching television. "Can I help you?" Roberto asked, entering the kitchen. Helena looked at him, surprised. "Do you know how to cook?" "No, but I can learn." She hesitated, then handed him a knife and some vegetables. "You can chop these." They worked in silence for a few minutes. Roberto chopped the vegetables slowly, clumsily. Helena stirred the pot and checked the seasoning. "Helena," Roberto began, not knowing how to continue. She looked at him, waiting. "The partners want to remove me from the company." Helena stopped stirring the pot. "What do you mean?" "They want to put someone else in my place. They say I'm no longer focused enough." "And are you going to let them?" "I don't know, maybe." Helena dropped the spoon and turned completely to him. "Roberto, that company is your life. You built it from scratch. You sacrificed everything for it. And you're going to let them take it just like that?" "Maybe I sacrificed too much." She stayed in silence, processing those words. "The meeting is Friday," Roberto continued. "I need to decide what to do. If I fight to keep the company, I'll have to go back to being what I was, work 16 hours a day, travel, forget that I have a family. But if I let it go, I lose everything I built." "It's not everything," Helena said softly. "It's just work. To you, maybe. But to me, it was always more than that. It was proof that I made it, that I won." "And do you need to keep proving it?" Roberto had no answer for that. Dinner was silent, but not uncomfortable. For the first time in a long time, there was something different in the air. A tension, yes, but also a possibility of real change. After dinner, Roberto went to Julia's room. He knocked on the door. "I'm busy," she replied, without opening. "Julia, please, I need to talk to you." After a few seconds, she opened the door. "What?" "Can I come in?" She moved out of the way, making room. Roberto entered and sat on the edge of the bed. Julia stood, arms crossed. "I know you don't trust me," Roberto began. "I know I disappointed you many times, but I need you to know something." "What?" "Nothing I achieved is worth it if you're not proud of me. If you look at me and only feel anger and sadness, because in the end, nothing I built matters if I lost you in the process." Julia stayed in silence, but her eyes were watering. "I know I can't change the past," Roberto continued, "but I'm trying to be different, and maybe I'll never manage to recover everything I lost. But I'm not going to stop trying, because you are my daughter, and I love you, even having been terrible at showing it." A tear ran down Julia's face. "Are you being serious?" "Completely." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "I know, and that's okay. You don't need to trust me now. You just need to give me the chance to try." Julia nodded slightly. "Okay, but if you disappear again, I'm not going to give you another chance." "I won't disappear." She approached, hesitant, and Roberto stood up. Julia hugged him quickly, almost with fear, and then pulled away. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, daughter." Roberto left the room with a heavy heart. It was little, but it was something. On Friday, the day of the meeting arrived. Roberto woke up early, earlier than usual. He couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what he would say, how he would defend himself. But the more he thought, the more he realized he didn't want that anymore. He didn't want to live for the company anymore. He didn't want to prove anything anymore. He didn't want to sacrifice his family for profits and growth anymore. Before going to the office, he made a stop. At the signal on Cardial Arco Verde. Mateus was there with Clarice. When he saw Roberto, he ran to the car. "Mr. Roberto, it's been a long time since you passed by here." "I know. I've had some complicated days. Is everything okay with you?" "Everything. Look, I got a 9 on the Portuguese test." Mateus showed the crumpled test he took out of his backpack. Roberto took it, looked at it, and smiled. "Congratulations, champion. See, I told you were smart." The boy smiled, proud. "I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up." "You are?" "I am. To take care of my mother when she gets old." Roberto felt a tightness in his throat. Clarice approached, embarrassed. "Sorry, Mr. Roberto, he keeps saying these things." "No need to apologize, it's beautiful." Roberto looked at Mateus, at that child who had so little but dreamed so big. And suddenly everything became clear. "Mateus, can I ask you something?" "You can. Never let anyone convince you that you can't get what you want. Never let work make you forget what really matters, okay?" "Okay," the boy replied without completely understanding, but nodding anyway. Roberto gave Clarice more money, waved to the two of them, and went to the office. The meeting started at exactly 2 o'clock. All the partners were there. Marcelo opened with a prepared speech about necessary changes, restructuring, and a vision for the future. Fernando presented a management plan. Other partners agreed. Roberto listened to everything in silence. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up. "You guys are right," he began, and saw the surprise on their faces. "I no longer have the same commitment as before, not because I don't care about the company, but because I realized that life is not just work." "So you agree with the change?" Marcelo asked. "No, I propose something else." "What?" "I step down from the CEO position. Fernando takes over. But I maintain my participation as a partner, and more than that, I want to create a program in the company. A program for work-life balance, flexible hours, extended leaves, psychological support. Because if I'm noticing this now, other employees must also be suffering from the same thing." The partners looked at each other. "And I want to donate part of my profits," Roberto continued, "to institutions that work with children in vulnerable situations, education, food, support. It's not charity, it's responsibility." Marcelo stayed in silence for a long moment. "Are you sure about this?" "Completely." "And the company? Aren't you going to miss being in command?" "I will, but I'll miss my family more if I continue losing them." Fernando spoke up. "I accept the position, and I think the program is a great idea." Other partners agreed. It wasn't what they expected, but it made sense. The meeting ended with an agreement. Roberto would leave the day-to-day of the company, but maintain strategic influence. He would continue being a partner. He would continue participating in the profits. But he would no longer be a slave to work. When he left the room, he felt something strange. It wasn't complete relief. It wasn't absolute sadness. It was a mixture, loss and gain at the same time. But for the first time in a long time, he felt he had made the right choice. He arrived home in the middle of the afternoon. Helena was in the living room reading. She raised her eyes, surprised. "What happened?" "I resigned." "What do you mean?" Roberto told her everything. The meeting, the decision, the program, the donation. Helena stayed in silence, processing. "Are you sure?" "I am. For the first time in my life, I'm sure about something." She stood up and walked over to him. And for the first time in years, Helena hugged Roberto. A real hug, not quick, not an obligation. A hug that said everything without needing words. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. And Roberto there, hugging the woman he almost lost, realized he had chosen the right side. It wasn't the end of the problems, it wasn't a magic solution, but it was a new beginning. And sometimes, starting over is the bravest thing someone can do. 6 months had passed since the meeting that changed everything. Roberto still woke up early, but no longer at 5:30 in the morning with that desperate urgency of someone fighting against time. He woke up at 7, had breakfast calmly, and asked Lucas about school while the boy ate cereal at the kitchen table. Small things, trivial for most people, but for Roberto, they were silent revolutions. The company continued to grow. Fernando was doing well as CEO. There were decisions Roberto didn't completely agree with, meetings he would have conducted differently. But he learned to let go. He learned that he didn't need to control everything, that things could work without him being at the center of everything all the time. The work-life balance program was showing results. Employees who previously lived exhausted could now breathe. There was a shift schedule, extended leaves for fathers and mothers, and free psychological support. Productivity didn't fall. On the contrary, people worked better when they had time to live. And the donation Roberto had proposed, that had turned into something bigger than he imagined. With part of the company's profits, they created a fund for scholarships, food, and school supplies for children in vulnerable situations. There were 15 children in the first month, then 30. Now there were almost 100, and Mateus was the first. Roberto would never forget the day he told Clarice about the full scholarship at a nearby private school, with materials included, uniform and snacks. The woman had cried so much, she could barely manage to say thank you. Mateus stayed silent, processing, and then looked at Roberto with those clear eyes and simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Roberto," as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Today was Saturday. Roberto was in the club bleachers watching Lucas's game. The team was tied 5-5, and there were 10 minutes left until the end. Lucas played as a fullback, running from one side to the other, sweaty and concentrated. Beside Roberto, Helena held a cup of coffee and cheered softly. She had returned to smiling, not constantly, not in an exaggerated way, but that small and genuine smile that Roberto hadn't seen in years was back. Julia was a little further back, sitting with 2 friends, but she had come. That was already a lot. In the first few months, she refused any invitation. She didn't believe Roberto was going to stay present. But he did. Week after week, game after game, school event after school event. And gradually, Julia began to let go of her defenses. Last week, she had entered his office at home and left an essay on the desk. Roberto picked it up and read it. It was about second chances, about how people can change if they really want to. At the end, there was a note from the teacher, 10, and a note from Julia. "I thought you would like to read this." Roberto kept that essay in the drawer as if it were gold. The game continued intensely. Lucas received the ball, dribbled past an opponent and crossed to the center. The team's striker finished it. Goal! The bleachers exploded. Roberto stood up, shouted and celebrated. Helena laughed at his excitement. Julia filmed everything on her cell phone. When the game ended, Lucas ran to them, sweaty and happy. "Did you see the goal, Dad?" "I saw it. It was incredible." "You made the perfect pass," his mother added. Lucas smiled in that way of a child who is truly happy. "Are we going to celebrate?" "Of course. Where do you want to go?" "Pizza place." "Then the pizza place it will be." They all went together. On the way, Julia told about a school project. Lucas talked about the next championship. Helena commented on a new architectural project she was developing, and Roberto just listened, participated, and laughed. It was simple, it was common, it was everything. At the pizzeria, while they waited for the order, Lucas asked when Roberto was going to take him and Julia to meet Mateus. "He tells a lot of stories about his school. It must be cool." "We can go next week if you guys want," Roberto replied. "Mateus would love to meet you." Julia, who was on her phone, raised her eyes. "Is he that boy you helped?" "Yes." She nodded pensively. "Cool, I'll go." Roberto felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the good kind, the one that comes from gratitude. After the pizza, they returned home. Lucas went straight to the video game. Julia went up to her room. Helena began to tidy the kitchen. "Let me tidy up," Roberto said. She smiled. "You don't know how to tidy a kitchen properly." "Then you teach me." They worked together, washing dishes, drying and putting them away. At one point, Helena rested her head on his shoulder. "You really are different." "I am?" You are, and I like this version. I do too, Roberto said, kissing the top of her head. That night, after everyone went to sleep, Roberto stayed in the living room looking at old photos on his phone. There were so many he didn't even remember taking. Julia as a baby, Lucas learning to walk, Helena pregnant. Moments that he had recorded, but not truly lived. He was always with his head somewhere else, thinking about work, meetings, and strategies. But now he was present, really present. On Sunday, they went to visit Mateus at his house, a simple construction in a distant neighborhood, but clean and organized. Clarice received them with a carrot cake she had made especially. Mateus showed his room to Lucas and Julia, proud of the new books he got from school and the uniform hanging in the closet. Julia talked a lot with him, asked about classes and about friends. Lucas challenged Mateus to a video game match. Helena and Clarice had coffee in the small kitchen, talking about children, challenges, and dreams. And Roberto stayed there, observing everything, feeling a fulfillment he never imagined possible. Before they left, Mateus pulled Roberto aside. "Mr. Roberto, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "I wanted to say thank you for everything, for the school, the materials, for believing in me." "You don't need to thank me, Mateus. You deserve all of this. But it's not just that," the boy continued. "You changed, I notice it. In the beginning you seemed sad, now you don't anymore." Roberto smiled, moved. "You're right, I changed, and part of it is because of you." "Me?" "Yes, you taught me that being happy isn't about having a lot. It's about being present, about valuing people, about truly living." Matthias gave that simple and genuine smile. "That's good, then." On the way back home, Helena held Roberto's hand. Julia and Lucas talked in the back seat, and for the first time in a long time, Roberto felt complete. It wasn't perfect. There were still difficult moments. There were still arguments, misunderstandings, and frustrations. Julia still had days when she went back to being distant. Helena still carried hurts that would take time to heal completely. Lucas was still a child and had his tantrums. But it was real, it was honest, it was a real family. That night, lying in bed, Roberto thought about everything that had happened, about how a moment of fragility had opened his eyes, about how an 8-year-old boy selling candies on the street had become the catalyst for the greatest transformation of his life. He had lost absolute control of the company he built. He had given up part of the power that took years to conquer. He had reduced his earnings by donating to social causes. But he had gained something infinitely more valuable. He had gained his family back. He had gained the ability to feel, to be present, to love without fear. And he realized that everything he sacrificed over the years in the name of success was worth nothing if there was no one to share it with. True success, he discovered too late, was never in the numbers, the contracts, the buildings, or the cars. It was in the hugs, in the smiles, in the simple conversations, in the banal moments that, when lived with attention, became extraordinary. Roberto Almeida was 45 years old when he began to truly live. And even knowing that there was still a long way ahead, that regaining lost trust would be the work of years, he was at peace. Because he finally understood that life was not a race with a finish line. It was a journey, and the important thing wasn't arriving fast. It was walking beside the right people. He looked at Helena sleeping beside him. He thought of Julia and Lucas in their rooms. He thought of Mateus, who now had a future. He thought of all the company employees who now had time to live. And he smiled, because for the first time in decades, Roberto Almeida was not building an empire. He was building a life, and that, he was sure, was the only construction that really mattered. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Roberto, Helena, Julia, Lucas, and Mateus has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of transformation and second chances, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it Roberto's conversation with Julia, the meeting with Mateus, the choice in the meeting? Every day, we bring intense and